Welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am glad that you guys can join me this morning. It is an early Wednesday morning. Today is December 18th, if I'm getting my date correct. Yes, on the 18th. Look, guys, thank you for joining me this morning. We have a damn good show for you today, just like we have had all week, and we're going to keep that train ticking. If you guys dig this content, please give it a like. I know that's presumptive of me to say so, but it is a damn good show. And we have some really good guests today and some really good topics. So if you dig this content, give it a like, share it, subscribe to it. I'm trying to reach 40K by the end of the year. And with your help, damn it, we can do it. On top of that, hit the notification bell. I pop in at all times of the day, at night, because, that's what newsmen do. This is what we do. We were having this conversation one day. I think it was Malik. We were going to send him, or the company was going to send him to Europe to cover some event. And, in doing those events, there have been times where I have had to be up at like 4 in order to do the show, or even earlier, like let's say like 3 in the morning, then have to be up to cover the event all the way up till like 10 o'clock, and then wake up at 3 in the morning again and do it. And when we were talking to it, I was like, okay, well, he doesn't have to do that. And my boss was like, this is what we do. This is what we do. This is how we cover the news. So there are a few stories that are popping off that are super fascinating. So the Russian general that was assassinated, I mean, you can't even call it assassination, it's basically a murder. Not affiliated with the war zone, not planning war, fighting, or anything like that. He was a general dealing with chemical weapons, and they murdered him with a bomb, killing him and apparently an aide of his. Now, Moscow has vowed retaliation for this killing, but that's the rub. I mean, at a certain point, what do you do? I mean, truth be told, it seems that the Ukrainian military is at once bragging about it while simultaneously trying to imply that, well, these are just disaffected Russians that are doing this. Okay, well, you can't have it both ways. I don't know if anybody believes that. I think everybody and their mama at this point knows that this was Ukraine that was responsible for this. And so the catch becomes, okay, well, what do you do about it? Because you're stuck trying to walk a tightrope. Ukraine, at this very moment, is doing any and everything in its power to get the world into a third world war. You must understand, from their point of view, it's existential for Ukraine anyway. And the only chance that they have of doing anything in this contest, in this test of strength, is to get the West involved directly into the conflict in regards to either getting troops on the ground or somehow getting some kind of military assets involved from Western countries. And I don't mean that in the sense of giving a missile here and having Ukraine fire it. I mean, Ukraine requires a larger commitment and a larger intrusion into this war by Western powers for them to have any chance at all. So all of these things are radically provocative because that's what they're trying to do. They want an overreaction. They want to push Russia to do something that, at the very least, could create some kind of justification to get further ensconced in the conflict. And again, they're also doing this under a Biden when, from their point of view, Donald Trump will most likely try to push them into some kind of agreement where they're going to have to give up territory in order to end the war. Now, I know that Biden knows this. I would imagine Ukraine knows this. And I would imagine Russia knows this. So Russia's stuck trying to thread a needle. A, we need to respond because we need to stop this level of provocation. It is unacceptable for all intents and purposes, just murder. On the other side, the response can't be an overreaction. Like, I hope you get what I mean. It's a tightrope. I mean, personally, I know a lot of people at this point feel like there needs to be an overwhelming reaction, that the Oreshnik didn't do the job of creating this warning, creating this thought of stop this escalation now. And there are a few reasons for that. Part of it has to do with the fact that Ukraine is not necessarily in charge of Ukraine. If I if I if I have military assets on the ground that I am completely disconnected to, meaning I don't care about the men, I don't necessarily care about the country, I care about how I look in all of this. But for all intents and purposes, if these people die, get killed, if you lower the draft age, that doesn't exactly overtly affect me, especially in the context of what I'm trying to accomplish. Because, as I point out, what you're trying to do usually takes precedence over everything else. Well, if you're the US, the entire reason, the entire point of this is to stick it to the Russians. Yeah, you may want to try to drag Ukraine into NATO, or for that matter, even Georgia into NATO, because you want that pivot point, that platform on which to attack that's on the border of Russia. And as I pointed out before, the incursions into Russia often, usually, it's very least from the last few wars, went through Ukraine. So if you're the US, you're aware of this. You want Ukraine to be that pivot point, meaning you want Russia to either accept it or to get dragged into some kind of conflict. Okay, you got them dragged into a conflict. But the problem for Ukraine is that the US doesn't have Ukraine's interests. I can't even say best interests. I mean, just interests in general in mind, because for all intents and purposes, these aren't American troops. Send your people out there to die for our objective of sticking it to the Russians. Meaning, this is not a situation where a general or president is overtly concerned about its own citizens being killed or its own population going without fuel or freezing to death in the wintertime. This is a U.S. that is somewhat distant from the decisions to which are being made on the battlefield. So if you got all of these people, if you get 500,000 dead Ukrainians, they're not Americans. If you get Ukrainians not being able to heat the houses in the wintertime, they're not Americans. I mean, at the end of the day, all of this always goes back to they're not Americans, and our key objective is to stick it to the Russians. Ukraine does not have anybody who is looking out for Ukrainian interests, including the government that, all things being equal, you would think would be looking out for Ukrainian interests. No, for all intents and purposes, they're pushing U.S. policy in this situation. And part of the reason, or part of, to make that point clearer, if you remember, one of the arguments that was being made to the American population was A, these aren't Americans, and B, the money that's going to Ukraine is a small investment in comparison to what we want to do, which is kill the Russians. And C, the money that we're spending that's going to Ukraine for all intents and purposes coming back to us, because much of that money is going to buy weapon systems to replenish the weapons that we sent Ukraine. Notice in this conversation, Ukraine doesn't really factor into it, short of being a proxy, a tool to accomplish a particular objective. I'm saying that this has been the modus operandi going all the way through, and it remains so now. So if Russia goes with this overwhelming response, again, the US's point of view, they're not Ukrainians or they're not Americans. Meaning every answer that Russia comes up with, regardless of how punishing it is, regardless of how brutal it is, will ultimately come back from the standpoint of Americans. Well, those aren't Americans. It's cynical. It's deeply, deeply cynical. And yet, here we are. And I guess my point is, from the Ukrainian perspective, it's existential for them anyway. Ukraine has no idea what Ukraine is ultimately going to be at the end of this. And so, from their point of view, the only chance that they have, and it's not even a chance to win it, just the only chance to draw it, is to draw the West into the war, which, for all intents and purposes, may be the end of all things. But from the Ukrainian government, it is the end of all things anyway. So we will see how this evolves. Mark Sleboda is going to be on to talk about it this morning. I look forward to talking to Mark. There's a lot to go over, so I'm looking forward to having that conversation with Mark. One of the other issues that's also still bubbling up, drones. Still no idea where the drones are coming from, and we are not getting an honest assessment from the administration. So this is John Kirby. John Kirby, who came out once before saying these were civilian aircraft and that they hadn't been in unrestricted airspace. And as I showed article after article, at the time, there were two incursions into military airspace, including Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I even played the clip of the pilots talking about drones being on in the airspace, which was effectively shutting down the airspace for that same airbase. Kirby is asked about this once again because, again, Kirby got it so wrong last time. They were like, dude, are you still sticking with that story about these being, no military airspaces, that these are human driven craft, as opposed to quote unquote drones that everyone is saying that they were to people who were on the ground? This is Kirby.
As we look at the information we've got, Brett, and we've now examined some 5,000 different sightings, we've added detection capabilities, additional observers. As you and I stand here today, to date, our assessment is that this is lawful, legal, commercial, hobbyist, and even law enforcement aircraft activity. Some of it's manned, some of it's unmanned. We absolutely acknowledge that a lot of these are probably drones, but they're flying legally, and it is legal to fly drones in non-restricted airspace as long as you're registered with the FAA. And there's thousands and thousands of these kinds of flights every single day. I think there's more than 1 million drones that are registered with the FAA.
Therein lies the rub. Therein lies the rub. These things have been taking place in military airfields. It's not just civilian areas. But I want to bring in my guests. We are joined with the one and only Mark Sleboda, international relations and security analyst, and easily one of my favorite people to talk to. How you doing, Mark? You doing all right?
Tomorrow, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
No, man, it's always an honor and pleasure to have you. Mark, I guess we have to start with the Russian general being murdered. I can't even call it. Wait a minute, one second. I can't even call it um a killing or an assassination. It's just murder. I mean, this General Kirillov wasn't part of the battlefield, from my understanding. He wasn't even part of the military in the sense of like active operations. He was in the chemical weapons. What is going on with this? What is the latest on this story? And for that matter, why do you think he was killed? Was it just killing somebody to kill somebody because he wasn't the most, let's say, guarded? Give me your take on this. What's going on?
Yeah, okay. So there was, I would call it an assassination. I would call it an assassination that occurred with terrorist methods. Because it was a bombing that was conducted in a civilian area. If this had been the United States, well, then it would be a U.S. general, no matter who the U.S. was at war with or in conflict with or intervening in, right? It would certainly be called a terrorist act. Right. When, for instance, attacks were made on U.S. warships, that was also called a terrorist act. So I would feel justified because of the methodology that was used. Right. A bombing, improvised explosive device, something around 300 grams of TNT hidden evidently in the handle of a scooter. That was placed along the outside, the entrance of this Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov's apartment building. And unfortunately, as someone less than pleased about it, I would say that that actually the way scooters are ubiquitous in Moscow now, right? Not just among youth and teenagers, but couriers and everything else. Unfortunately, that is one of the things that, unless there is really tight security over him, would probably, has the possibility of escaping notice. The person who arranged everything on the ground for the attack. An Uzbek citizen whom was caught. He came to Moscow specifically for this. He has made confessions already that he did this on orders from Ukrainian intelligence. And I mean, you could of course argue, oh, if he's in Russian custody, then we can't take anything he says for granted, except that CNN and The Independent and BBC and a whole host of Western and Ukrainian newspapers from their own sources, anonymous sources within the Ukrainian, the Kiev regime's intelligence services, have said that the SBU claims credit for it. Not officially, but unofficially through anonymous. They're playing that coy game, right? Because of potential diplomatic and legal implications, they're not going to come right out and say, yeah, we assassinated a Russian general, but they're going to come out and say it. They're going to brag about it unofficially, right? And we've seen this, pattern several times before. Now, the Kiev regime has a whole host of assassinations using bombings and killings under their belt. Just last week, a top Russian missile expert, Mikhail Shatsky, was gunned down in a park in Moscow. And we've seen previous attacks on high-ranking Russian military officers, not as high as Kirillov. He's certainly the highest so far, but we've seen it. And then we've seen the terrorist bombings of the civilians, the journalist philosopher Daria Dugina, the former East Ukrainian war correspondent and blogger Vladimir Tatarsky, who was also killed in a bombing. And if you're talking East Ukrainian or self-identifying as former East Ukrainian, politicians, officials, activists, there have literally been hundreds of such assassinations, with bombings and shootings in the last 10 years that continue right up to this very day. Hundreds. And we've already heard a statement from the U.S. We have no comment. We knew nothing. We saw nothing. Right? If you want to believe that the U.S. doesn't know what the Kiev regime's intelligence services is up to. Yet, amazingly enough, wasn't it just last year that we had an article in the New York Times where they bragged that U.S. intelligence came in and rebuilt Ukrainian intelligence from the ground up in their own image. They were quite proud about that. They were bragging about it. So now suddenly they don't, they don't know what the Ukrainian military is doing when it does something that is, shall we say, that you don't openly want to claim credit for. Now, he was a general and there is a conflict going on, but there is, as well as international, rules of war, laws of war under the Geneva Convention, there are also norms of war, right? And bombings targeting military and political leaders is not something that any country, well, I have to say that there's actually been a lot of European officials that have openly, endorsed the killing. So, but generally, sane political leaders in the U.S., they just, no comment. We have nothing to say. We didn't like the guy, but, we'll refer you to the Ukrainians. That was literally the statements that we heard from Count Smirkula. Mark Miller. So it's the reason why the Kiev regime doesn't openly proclaim this is because of these norms of war, and the fear of such a path leads to a type of total war of annihilation that could be used against you, right? What is stopping this? The only thing stopping Russia from assassinating Ukrainian political and military leaders, as has been done to numerous Russians, is a restraint and a adherence to the norms of war and the laws of war, which, while I would never claim that they were 100%, this is a high intensity conflict. It is very heated, and crimes occur on both sides. Just that on one side they're a lot more open and a lot more egregious, but there is an attempt to adhere to the laws and norms of war on the Russian side, to fight an honorable war. And partly because of that, I mean, part of the reason for that, why doesn't Russia wipe out the Kiev regime leadership? You hear this again and again by, people in comments and everything. And I have to admit, I feel a knee-jerk reaction myself, right? I feel, I want to strike back. I want vengeance. I want a tit for tat, a quid pro quo. But luckily, I'm not the Russian president. He's a lot more pragmatic and cold-blooded and calculating than I am. But part of the reason why Russia is trying its best to fight the good war is for diplomatic reasons, right? The reason, or certainly probably the single most important reason, that the Russia has survived the existential economic war of sanctions that the West has been waging on it, and managed to grow. The economy is still growing, at a healthy clip, despite all of this, is because the rest of the world outside the West refused to stop trading with Russia. They refused to, participate in the West's existential economic war of sanctions, even when, the U.S. makes the comment, you're either with us or against us, right? That hasn't worked. And so that is certainly, I think, a big part of the rationale within the Russian government, that we need to fight the good war to keep the rest of the world on our side. We are winning the way it is right now. So there is a constant fear that a breaking of the perception, at least by the rest of the world outside the West, right? They don't, the Western mainstream media propaganda is an entirely a different story, right? But the rest of the world can see what is going on and take a look at, I don't know, say what Israel is doing in Palestine or what the U.S. did in Iraq. And, Russia seems to be trying to do their best to show restraint, right? To follow norms of war that have not been followed in other such instances. So that I think that's a big part of the rationale. As to the question of why Kirillov, why now? First of all, there's actually comments from people close to him that he had received, that he was afraid that he had received some type of word that he was now being hunted. So he may have even known or had some type of fear that this was coming. You're absolutely right. He has no direct. He's not planning or commanding troops in anything to do with the special military operation on the battlefield. The only thing that he has been doing in that regard is he was the head of Russia's CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear defense forces. And as part of that job, he was documenting all of the Kiev regime's uses of chemical weapons, the Pentagon's funding of these bio research laboratories, that Russia has recovered, well, at least one, probably more from, that we saw, documentation presented, and maybe simply, cataloging these crimes. Now, the Kiev regime has had, when it comes to chemical weapons, the Kiev regime has what I would call as small scale use of chemical weapons, mostly local, nothing large and systemic. And most of the chemical weapons that have been used have been irritants, agents that that might be equivalent in certain crowd control situations in certain countries, but whose use is forbidden in war, right? There may have been a few isolated instances of something small, but even then, this isn't large scale or systemic. It's more scattered and perhaps at a local level, but it has definitely been present. Now, the Kiev regime suddenly, just in the 24 hours before the targeted assassination of Kirillov, they suddenly accused him of war crimes, right? This type of projection that the Kiev regime does, that Russia was using chemical weapons, of which there is no credible evidence whatsoever, right? Let's be frank. This is pure projection. And so that justifies, they declared, therefore, he was a legitimate target. But the fact that he was removed from the SMO, the methodology that was used in killing him, one of his aides, one of his assistants was also killed in the explosion, and evidently his driver, who was waiting in the car right there, he was injured but survived despite damage to the car. So obviously, Russia, the Russian military leadership and the Russian political leadership are incensed about this, right? Because, this is reaching out with another bombing in Moscow, right? Now, again, obviously the intention of this is terror, right? To make people fear. Also, perhaps to create tensions between the political and military leadership. Because if the Russian government does not, and to be fair, they probably won't respond half-cocked, and they will not do it, almost certainly an over response to this, as they have done to other things. Maybe part of the hope is that the Russian generals will be pissed off at Putin for not taking action when one of their own, and a high-ranking one. And he was really high-ranking. I mean, he was also a deputy to the Russian Security Council. I mean, he regularly reported to them. So very, very high-level general, very well-regarded in Russia for what he did, which was defense forces against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear attacks. And his documentation of the crimes of the Kiev regime and what the nefarious things that the U.S. was up to on Ukrainian soil, with biological research labs and other things, is regarded as of an extremely high caliber of documentation. But I think you're also right that because he was not an active general in the SMO, the security around him may not have been as tight as it was around other people. And maybe they, through some surveillance of him and his routines and such, determined that he was a relatively easy target in that regard, a high-ranking, relatively easy target that would accomplish this. And part of the is also provocation, right? Again, everything is to provoke Russia into a response, because they're not getting any results on the battlefield, right? Obviously, Russia goes from progress to victory to progress, continually at this point, for over a year. We're going on well over a year of essentially ceaseless Russian offensive.
Right.
So there's a need to change the information warfare. Always, the Kiev regime is very conscious of the information war, and this dominates the headlines. You're not worried about the fall of Kirillov. You're not talking about Russian further progress, kicking out their Kursk incursion, or that Pokrovsk is itself literally coming under siege now.
Right.
You're not talking about that. You're talking about an assassination of a military leader who was not in any way directly involved in the special military operation. But I have to say, again, this is not the first one. We've seen multiple ones. There was another assassination that got less coverage just last week. And you can expect a lot more such dirty tricks, right? Such, the U.S. might call it, military might call it unconventional warfare. You will see a lot more of this as the end. I don't like using the word end game, right? Because we can't make that. But the situation is getting worse and worse and worse for the Kiev regime. They're getting more and more desperate. And as that desperation increases, they will increasingly turn to such methods. And eventually, at some point, and I don't want to make any predictions about how long. I'm not optimistic that the war will be ended quickly. But, at some point, the overt war military war will end, but guerrilla war will almost certainly continue. And then it will be entirely things of such regard. So it's really something Russian government is just going to have to endure, at least until they remove the regime in Kiev, perhaps go further all the way to the Polish border. And even then, it may not entirely go away. Unfortunately, that's the reality of the conflict, unfortunately.
That's the rub with this, though. They have to do something. Because I guess my sense is you can't keep saying we're going to retaliate, we're going to retaliate, we're going to retaliate. And again, I agree with you. You're right. It is an assassination. He is at the very least part of the military, in the sense of, working with them as opposed to just rando person being killed. But I get the sense that Russia has to do something. I mean, the reality of it is, can they really afford to allow this type of killing without a legitimate response, whatever that legitimate response is?
They have many times before, unfortunately. I mean, that's the reality. Many of these killings go completely under the radar, right? When it's East Ukrainian officials, or former East Ukrainian, when it's officials and activists and leaders in the Donbass, in Zaporozhye, in Kherson, this happens all the time. It's happened hundreds of times. And it's not even newsworthy. It happens so much, certainly not in the Western media. Now, simply because he was the highest ranking and profile, there will be a show of a response. And certainly Medvedev has the new Zhirinovsky Medvedev, Medvedev 2.0, if you want to call him, who has become this, fire-breathing patriot. He has, said, I think correctly, but using, rather evocative language, that this is the agony of the Banderite regime, right? And in that sense, he's actually right. It's because they're dying, that they're, that slowly maybe, but they're going through this desperation measures as they look for a way outside of, the kill box. And he also, however, promised, that to destroy the political military leadership of the Kiev regime. He also made statements to that effect. Now, he's also made lots of comments before about attacks on decision-making centers and everything that haven't always panned out, shall we say. He's a lot of bluster and rhetoric coming from Medvedev. So while I would suspect, right, and I would be happy to be proved wrong on this, but I suspect that there will be a response, that they will announce some missile strikes that are going to target some intelligence facilities, something of that regard, right? And we will never really know how effective such strikes were. My understanding is that there have been previous strikes on the Kiev regime's SBU, their main intelligence directorate, that has claimed responsibility from this. And there have been strikes on the Kiev regime's military intelligence, the GUR, that has also admitted being involved in such type of assassinations before, but yet their work continues. Why? Because they're scattered, in underground facilities and the like. Supposedly, this was at least radioed in from Dnipropetrovsk. So maybe a strike on a Ukrainian a Kiev regime intelligence facility in Dnipropetrovsk. But I wouldn't expect anything more than that. Certainly, we're not going to see tit for tat. We're not going to see, assassinations, targeted killings, bombings in response. You're not going to see any attempted assassination of Zelensky, which, I know that there's propaganda in the Kiev regime regurgitated by the West, but, very early in this conflict, it was made clear even to the Israeli prime minister at the time, Naftali Bennett, that there would be no attempt to kill Zelensky. I don't believe that has ever changed, largely because, Russia doesn't really regard him as a very effective leader, either diplomatic or politically or military. And there's always the case that anyone who replaces him might be more formidable. So why? So I think there's part of that logic there. You're not going to see Russia carpet bombing Kiev or something of the sort. It will be a very calculated response. And unfortunately, the reality is that, unless they manage to get the head of the SBU or, something which seems unlikely to me, at least in the short term, then we will never really know how effective such response will be. But you're not going to see a half-cocked, mass response. With the last attack, right? Remember, Russia has made comments about the US's and the British attacks of deep inside Russia with missiles, with ATACMS or Storm Shadows and Scalps, with the fig leaf of a proxy Kiev regime somewhere in the vicinity when the US is firing those weapons. And just again, there was 6 attacks made in towards Taganrog in South Russia. And what was Russia's response? Nothing. They made a very large missile and drone attack that was almost certainly scheduled to occur against the Kiev regime's electrical and military industrial complex anyway, that would have had to be prepared weeks in advance. And they simply said, this is our response, right? And anyone who's paying attention knows that that's almost certainly not the situation, that they simply claim that. Why? Because the attack was so ineffective, they didn't even feel the need to respond. And because they don't want to escalate when they know that Trump has been, is going to take office, and whatever else he may or may not do in terms of de-escalation, he has outright said that he's against these missile attacks deep inside Russia, that he thinks it is stupid. I would say more suicidal and a death, a Götterdämmerung death wish, rather than necessarily stupid. But that's Trump's way with language, I guess. So Russia is winning. They're not going to take their eye off the ball. I mean, you've seen Star Wars: The New Hope, right?
Of course.
Yeah. Stay on target, right? I mean, that's language. They're not going to respond to provocations, like say I would in the heat of the moment. Putin is
not the most satisfying. I put it that way.
No,
and
it's not.
That was kind of the issue, right? Because from my point of view, it allows provocation without response. Continuous provocation without response, especially if it's in this kind of logic of Trump is coming in, so we don't necessarily want to do anything, and so we're going to give Ukraine a free hand to do whatever it wants because we want to wait for Trump to come in. That is a pathway to escalation, at least from my point of view.
Absolutely. And I've made the argument myself that if you don't respond, then that only encourages more escalation, right?
Yes.
I've made that. And they have certainly had that argument in the Kremlin. You can be sure that this has been discussed and argued, and ultimately, I think what they've come down on is that the ultimate revenge is winning, and we're not going to do anything that is going to escalate and potentially change that situation. All of this is infuriating pinpricks, right? Poking the bear. But ultimately, does it change the fact that Russia is winning and winning decisively on the battlefield, and that the Kiev regime and that, NATO, the US NATO, has no hope of altering that outcome? No, it doesn't. So that is cold-blooded. It is pragmatic, right? It is, very calculating to a degree that's Putin, right? I mean, that's what he is. And again, I myself have a very visceral response to these things, right?
Yeah.
Being an immigrant to Russia, feeling, very patriotic, having family, in Crimea and former and still some parts of Eastern Ukraine. I feel a gut reaction for, payback. Maybe that's the inner American in me screaming. Although lots of Russians have been screaming Russian animals. But ultimately, it's hard to argue with results. And, you can make the claim, oh, Russia hasn't, achieved anything. Russia is fighting all of NATO at this point. They're fighting the US. They've demilitarized NATO's military stocks, right? I mean, they're down to monthly production. That's all that they can support the Kiev regime with on so much that is needed for this type of war. And
No, I agree with you. I do agree with you. I mean,
it's not satisfying. I agree with you. It's not satisfying to me either.
And it is practical.
But
yeah, I get it.
It is pragmatic and practical. And also part of that calculation is Russia, saying, well, what can they do next to escalate? What infuriation will they do? Yet, someone has thought all of this out, and they've said, yeah, we can take that too. We can take it and keep going. And that is, exactly that argument, right? That we just had, that this will, if they don't respond, this will only encourage more. And yes, they've thought through that, I almost certainly assure you, and decided that they can take the next provocation too.
Well, speaking of the battlefield, Pokrovsk, what is taking place on the battlefield currently? I want to go to a side for a bit, but I do want to nail down what's currently taking place on the battlefield in Kirillov, for example, and in Pokrovsk.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been in the South, there's a whole bunch of things going on. We used to talk about these 3 Kiev regime supply and logistics centers behind the lines, right, in the Ocheretna direction, once the Kiev regime Russia had broken through the Kiev regime defenses at Avdiivka, right? Then we had the Ocheretna bloom, and then we started talking that there's these 3 supply centers back there. It was Pokrovsk, Kirillov, and Sleboda. And Sleboda is already firmly in Russian hands. In Kirillov, it's really just cleanup operations at this point. There's been hundreds of Kiev regime forces that are caught in a cauldron that south of Kirillov that they can't get troops out of. Kirillov is essentially facing the same thing. The last supply road into the city is already under heavy artillery and drone control, and there's really only a small section of the city still in Kiev regime hands. Kirillov, for all intents and purposes, is over. It's just the mopping up. And already the siege of Pokrovsk has begun, right? Russian forces are just a few kilometers outside. In fact, if you're counting suburbs, then it's already begun. And again, Russia is going to move on the city from multiple directions, right? We're not talking a full encirclement, almost certainly, but they're going to take it into pinchers. They're going to put the supply lines under a great deal of a pressure, right? First artillery and drone control, and then they'll cut them off one by one as much as they can, right? And at the same time, they will begin moving from probably from the east, from the north and the south in at the same time, right? As they've done in multiple, it's been proven very effective. And from what I've seen in the past 2 weeks, what defenses have been erected, at least in the outskirts of Pokrovsk, have not been formidable at all. So Russia has been able to move pretty steadily in that regard. And the implications, first of all, is because that this is a transport hub and logistics center, taking it away from the Kiev regime and putting it in Russian hands will cripple their logistics, supporting their last major holdouts, last major defensive line in the Donbass region, and will improve Russia's ability to project power in that direction. But also, if you go directly west of Pokrovsk, it's nothing, right? You're going directly into the Dnipropetrovsk region. Russian forces are, in some cases, around 10 kilometers or even less from the Dnipropetrovsk region at this point. And there's no significant urban centers, right, that are defendable. There's no fortifications. There's no topographical or geographic boundaries, right? It's steppe from Pokrovsk, undefended steppe for the most part, just very small settlements, all the way to Pavlograd on the banks of the Dnieper River and Dnipropetrovsk itself. So that is huge operational space, right? And well behind the Kiev regime's line. So there's every possibility that when Trump takes office on January 20th, not that Russia sets artificial political deadlines, timelines like that, but that Russian forces could be in a new region that they have not yet been in before. And again, this will cripple the Kiev regime's abilities to sustain operations in the Donbass region if Pokrovsk is gone as well. And that will also, we've got two other big settlements right now, Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, and they're down to a couple of streets and buildings apiece at this point, right? Both of those hard fought over urban agglomerations and fortified areas are, just hanging by a thread at this point. So you could very well see a lot of things being announced in very short order, right? Kirillov is officially taken. Toretsk is officially taken. Chasiv Yar is officially taken. And they're also moving in the north on Seversk and Kupiansk as well. So Russia is, again, they're not just attacking in one place. They're attacking along the entire front line. And the other thing that I would mention is expect to see another suicidal Kiev regime offensive.
Really?
Over the winter months. Absolutely. Syrskyi has outright said it, right? He's openly said it. There appears to be buildups in several areas. Again, they're probably thinking Trump taking into office and Trump will force a ceasefire and we need to take, to show that we're still fighting. And if we take something real quick, we can then trade it back when Trump forces negotiations, which are not going to happen, at least not on Trump's terms anyway. But so I would say that there's several areas of the front line where it is possible that the Kiev regime could launch an offensive. And must be said, they've received hundreds of U.S. strikers, right? Armored vehicles that we have not seen yet on the battlefield again, right? Since the you just said, Australia sent 50 older Abrams tanks, right? Germany also sent hundreds. This is a offensive force, right? Probably nothing near as big as 2023 summer offensive, but it is, obviously an offensive force that is being built up in reserve. They're having problems with it. Supposedly, a French-trained brigade, 1,000 troops, just deserted from it after their training. Because the desertion is such a big problem. People don't want to fight and die for this regime, but still they're going to try. So the first place is Bryansk in the north, right? We had the strikes in Belgorod and then the strikes, the incursion in Kursk, and Bryansk is just to the west of that. It's the last area in the north of Ukraine there. The furthermost western Russian region. And there's a big buildup of forces there on the Kiev regime side. Russian airstrikes and artillery have been very active behind the lines there. And there's even been a few Russian DRG incursions into that area, which means they're almost certainly looking to see what's coming. Now, there's several other possible areas where they could launch an offensive, and almost certainly some of these are meant to, obfuscate, say, and one of them will be real at least. So it could be another attempt to strike into the Belgorod region. Again, Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, Kursk, Belgorod, right? So to go back in the Belgorod region, where the neo-Nazis made attacks, earlier in the spring and last as well. There could also be attempts to cross the former Kakhovka Reservoir in the south, in the Zaporozhye region, to make another attempt to retake the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Again, part of the concern there is that the electricity shortfall that the Kiev regime is experiencing, plus, God knows what kind of nuclear false flag they could arrange getting their hands on a nuclear plant, so forth. And another maybe outside possibility is something in Moldova, the neighboring post-Soviet country with a pro-separatist Russian region, and a current vehemently pro-Western government, a small country, but that is extremely politically divided. And it must be said that in that separatist pro-Russian region, Transnistria, there is one of the largest Soviet arms depots. A huge amount of the weapons that were withdrawn from the former Warsaw Pact countries are in that arms depot. That is enough arms and ammunition for that the Kiev regime is very familiar with and doesn't need training on, and knows how to use, even if it's not all in the best of condition, that could sustain them for, I don't know, a year or two if they manage to get their hands on it. I would assume that it's probably rigged to blow, expecting that. But anyway, it would be very hard for Russia to reinforce troops in that area, because it's on the other side of the Odessa region of Ukraine, and it doesn't have any type of sea access. So that would be a horizontal escalation, taking the war outside of just Ukraine again. And of course, there are questions about the wisdom of such an act, and could that justify NATO direct intervention, and so forth and so on. But those are the four potentials. And almost certainly one of them is going to happen sometime later this winter when the ground is nice and frozen.
Let me ask you this. Assad's letter, what did you make of it? I'm curious.
Kind of lame, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
Is
it fair to say that the Russian point of... Oh, no, please finish.
No, go ahead. The Russian point of view?
I was going to say, is it fair to say the Russian point of view has a certain amount of derision associated with Assad, even if they're saying, yes, we're going to stick by our allies, we're sticking by our friends, etc. There seems to be a bit of derision directed in his way. But correct me if I'm wrong on this.
No. I mean, I can't tell you what the Kremlin thinks. I can't tell you what the discussions of Putin or the Russian National Security Council, but it's quite obvious that from videos we've seen, the Russian troops in Syria had nothing but contempt for a Syrian Arab army that ultimately obviously responded to subversion and co-option and took bribes or blackmail or threats or whatever and just stood down. They ordered their troops to go home, not to fight, right? Lots of contempt for that by Russian soldiers who were themselves ready to continue the fight, right. In Syria. This nonsense, there's some kind of 5D Russian chess, and that Russia was willing to sacrifice the entire nation of Syrian ethnic minorities all right, to jihadists because of some type of trap to lure NATO into. That's just no evidence. I mean, Russia was very upset about what happened, and while they expected and were already doing airstrikes for over a month into Idlib, a jihadi offensive, what they almost certainly did not expect was the amount of infiltration and subversion of the Syrian army, and that they would just give up the fight. And that has, of course, extended to, I think, to Assad to a very large degree. He did nothing, apparently, nothing publicly anyway, to speak to the Syrian people or rally the Syrian troops. There was silence, coming out of Damascus, on his regard, at least. Everything was falling apart, and he was apparently little more than an observer. And then he, retreated first to the Russian base in Hmaimim, and then eventually, although he says it was a little bit later than the presumed timeline, but there's a feeling that he simply wasn't strong enough, that he wasn't charismatic enough, that maybe, while he held for that decade between 2011 and 2019 of the active conflict, that he lost the frozen conflict, and perhaps, there's openly questions, and I think they're at least partially legitimate. I place the ultimate blame on Turkey and the Syrian Arab Army generals and officers who agreed to stand down, but I also don't think that there's, a question that Assad simply wasn't strong enough to keep the country together under the immiserating effects of U.S. sanctions and the illegal military occupation of Syria's natural resources, their oil and wheat, the rotting out of the Syrian state and military that has obviously occurred in the last 5 years. So I can't speak for the Kremlin, but simply when we're talking what's being said in the Russian press and the videos we've heard from Russian military on the ground in Syria, there is a lack of respect and no small amount of contempt to go around either.
Yeah, that was my take also. I saw, I think it was the foreign minister, or no, it was an ambassador or something to that effect when this first took place. And I think they call them cowardly. I mean, they didn't hold back in regards to their contempt. And I saw the videos of the Russian troops that was watching this kind of caravan of men just dropping their weapons and leaving. Yeah, so it did seem
that was extremely foul Russian language. That was mocked. Russia has entire dictionaries of cursing. It is an art form to be able, and my wife has never allowed me to learn proper Russian mock, by the way. It is so much stronger than American cursing. Like it is a literal, it's becoming less of a taboo than it once was, I guess, modern culture, post 91 and everything, but still there's a strength and a stigma to it that doesn't happen with American cursing, which is really, what, you got 7 words? I mean, that's right. Just put together in different patterns and everything. It's that appear in practically every Hollywood movie anyway. So yeah, it's definitely not the same thing. So there was a great deal of creative mott on Syrian, deserters or sellouts or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, we have about 30 seconds, but I would imagine from the Russian point of view, we gave our lives, we gave our money.
A lot of political capital and treasure. Yeah.
Yeah, and when it came down to it, called it quits. Mark, man, thank you. Well, I always appreciate these conversations, Mark. You always give me some kind of context to put this stuff in, especially since you're there, you're on the ground, and you've been paying attention to it. And I've always appreciated your intake on this stuff. So thank you for this.
And I always enjoy our conversations. So
excellent. Mark Sleboda,
I admire your hat.
Thank you. I'm thinking of getting a hat. What does they call those things? A collaboration, a hat collaboration with somebody. It's like I wear them all the time. But Mark Sleboda, international relations and security analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. You can find him on his YouTube channel at Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, and of course on Facebook.com/Gramsci. Definitely check his content out. If you wanted some kind of context on what is taking place, you have some of the best analysis that I've come across, Mark. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me.
All right.